From the Banner offices along the Inner Harbor, it is the Banner Baseball Show. Paul Mancano and John Meoli live on a Tuesday in February. John, another week goes by where I do not watch the Fast and Furious movies, but we did get a review on Apple Podcasts, because if you write us a 5-star review, I will read it out here on the show. Tyrese, with about 18 E's, writes, "I'm here for the Fast and Furious banter. It's not a family movie. It's a movie about family." Quote from John Meoli. He said, just a fantastic, outstanding quote from Meoli. 5 stars from a fellow Fast and Furious enthusiast. I have that on the to-do list. It remains on the to-do list. And I think I have about 5 weeks now. I think it's exactly a month pretty much until opening day.
Yeah, 26, right? Yeah, we're getting there basically. February and March are cool because
26.
Because
so not
the
exactly
days of the month are the same.
Yes,
in March as they were in February.
It's nice.
Yeah. I feel like it should not be as hard to figure out a night to just watch a Fast and the Furious movie.
You'd think.
I would. Many people would think that. I need to make it crystal clear that the reason this has not happened is because of me. And
it's not true.
Well, Paul, if you gave me a list of 9 nights of over the next, pick a number, how many over the next 5 weeks, month to make this happen, I would probably not be able to do all 9. And it's not.
You're a busy man.
But like not really, but like it's just like we can do this. We can do this. And the reason I just responded to that in the way that I did, because my initial thought is like, we can do this. We have a month. There's definitely a will. There's got to be a way. And I'm like, well, this weekend we're going to Chicago. The next weekend after that, we got a thing on Friday. Then we might go back down to Sarasota. And then I'm going to go to a bachelor party. And then all of season starts. So like a weeknight Fast and Furious watch is possible. I suppose it's probably the only way to do it. And we've already, to go behind the curtain a little bit, sometimes I show up and I'm just like, we got to do this fast. And I just start talking about absolute nonsense and we go off the rails.
That's exactly the kind of mood I want to get you in. You came in hot this morning.
You
got a lot going
modestly activated.
Activated is a good way to put it. Well, the Orioles are activated. They are playing spring training games. We're not going to spend too much time breaking those down because they're meaningless baseball games. Good to see that Pete Alonso has already hit a couple homers as a Baltimore Oriole. The opening day starter competition is heating up, despite the fact that on the backfields after the first week, Trevor Rogers was mowing guys down, and we asked Kyle Bradish about opening day starter, and he said, I don't know if it's much of a competition the way that Trevor Rogers is pitching, but it is still probably a toss-up between Kyle Bradish and Trevor Rogers at this point. So far, Trevor Rogers, first start of the spring, 2 innings, 1 hit allowed, 3 Ks. Kyle Bradish, his first start of the spring, 3 innings, 3 hits, 2 earned runs, a walk, and 2 Ks. We're going to spend a lot of time on this podcast talking about Trevor Rogers and whether the Orioles should engage him on a contract extension. But first, John, do you see that kind of as an open competition for opening day starter between Bradish and Rogers?
I guess I always like to look at it from the position of like, what would the guy who maybe doesn't have the best case want to happen? If Kyle Bradish had the season that Trevor Rogers had last season, and there was somebody who made 8 starts and also had started opening days before, who was, in pursuit of that distinction, honor too. Like, I'm sure Kyle Bradish, if he was in Trevor Rogers' shoes, would be like, I earned this last year. Yeah. Like, that's not to say that he's not going to do it next year or shouldn't have done it the years he did it. But like in this context right now, and, I think veteran pitchers coming into the mix changed that. Kyle Bradish probably earned that in Corbin Burns' year. And like, then Corbin Burns exists and you just like Corbin Burns start opening day. Like, that's kind of what happens. And I kind of view it always through that prism. It's like, everyone wants to, I'm sure. It's one of 162. It's also the first one of 162, but you also you would want to be evaluated on the merits that person who earned it probably would too.
Right. Yeah, no, exactly. It feels like a debate between college football teams trying to get into the college football playoff of like, you have somebody's got the better record, but the competition isn't as great. And somebody has the better track record. I mean, Bradish obviously has been an Orioles pitcher for longer. He was an ace the last time he pitched in a full season.
Yeah.
But Trevor Rogers is coming off some of the best 109 innings any Orioles pitcher has ever thrown in a season.
Yeah.
So to me, it's a little bit of a toss up, and I don't see either of them getting their feelings hurt if the other guy gets it.
That's the most important part.
Yeah, exactly. Let's talk about the Orioles infield, because the Orioles made a move as they search for a replacement for Jordan Westburg, who has a partially torn UCL, underwent a PRP injection, is out until at least the end of April. They signed second baseman Thairo Estrada, 30 years old, to a minor league deal, coming off a season in which he played in just 39 games for the Colorado Rockies, hit .253 with 3 homers and a 73 OPS plus. And John, I think right now you could do a lot of relitigating about the Orioles offseason. You look at the infield right now, and suddenly a group that looked incredibly deep and incredibly star-studded looks a little bit thin. Jordan Westburg out until the end of April. Jackson Holliday out for the first couple weeks of the regular season as he recovers from his surgery to remove his broken hamate bone. And John, you asked me yesterday on Slack, you said, should the Orioles have done more to their infield during the offseason? And I said, I'm going to point back to a conversation we had on this very podcast on January 7th, where I threw out names like Willie Castro and Isaiah Kiner-Falefa and Dylan Moore and Ramon Arias as possibilities for the Orioles to sign in free agency. Well, they're all gone. Willie Castro signed with the Mets. Kiner-Falefa signed with the Red Sox. Dylan Moore signed with the Phillies. Ramon Arias has, within the past week, signed with the St. Louis Cardinals. But you said none of them got your juices going, John. You weren't.
Did say that.
That was at the time, but that was when there was a healthy infield. Do you regret having not had your juices flow for these gentlemen?
Definitely not. I definitely don't regret not having my juices flow for any of those utility infielders that you mentioned. I wanted to have that conversation because we basically spent 2 weeks having a revisionist history conversation about like what a smart move it was to trade for Blaze Alexander. And the point of that was that there was a gulf between what they thought was going to happen and what could happen if everything went wrong. And they needed to address that gap. They probably addressed it in the best way possible, but they also addressed it very late on. And you know, this is almost like playing defense. I feel like there's not playing defense. Let me rephrase that. There are so many like straw man arguments around this team and the binary, like doing more, doing less, doing enough, doing not enough. They addressed every part of, until they made that trade, they addressed basically every part of their roster meaningfully. Except for the infield. Those are the names we were talking about, also because you are not going to tell somebody who is meaningfully higher or better than any of those players on the free agent list early in the offseason, late in the offseason, that Baltimore is a place for them to come and have a good year, play a ton, and like build their value. You're not going to convince anyone to do that because they're going to look at the piece of paper and be like, you guys don't even have enough room for the infielders. And we're using that charitably by including first base. You don't even have enough room for the infielders that you have on your roster right now. What are you going to do with me? The answer is, we're going to bring you to camp and guys are going to get hurt and then we're going to play. But that's not a satisfying answer. Nobody wants to hear that in January if you're a free agent. So it felt like something that was worth exploring. And I think I probably still feel the same way about those guys. Would you feel maybe a little bit better than what's in camp right now if you knew that one or more of those guys was going to be on the roster for a few weeks? Yeah. Is that person going to make or break the season? I don't think so.
Right. I think you make a great point about what a free agent is looking for. And you already had an all-star at third base. You had potentially a cornerstone at second base and former number 1 overall pick. You have a superstar MVP candidate at shortstop, and then you signed a first baseman to a 5-year, $155 million deal. There was no real playing time for a free agent. And I think that's part of the reason that they had to trade for Blaze Alexander. I know there was a lot of hemming and hawing about what they gave up, but they had to trade for that guy in part because, well, one, because of his age, and it's hard to get somebody who's that young, play that many different positions. Those guys don't often hit free agency, and if they do, they get a good amount of cash. But Blaze Alexander had to be a trade piece because it would be difficult to convince a free agent to come to Baltimore. But I think the bigger issue here, and it's something that you've touched on before, John, is the Orioles don't have that replacement in-house. When Jordan Westburg and Jackson Holliday go down, there isn't a ready-made prospect like there has been in previous years. I use the example of Connor Norby and Joey Ortiz. Those guys aren't walking through the door. I mean, the top 30 prospect list is not exactly littered with guys who are ready to step in at the AAA level. A lot of their infield prospects are far away from the big leagues, like Vahiva Aloy, Aaron Estrada. Those guys aren't coming up in 2026. Their AAA roster doesn't have a whole lot of young, exciting prospects in the infield who are ready to step in. And now I'm looking at how we're trying to figure out this opening day roster. And I will say, I think there's a little bit too much obsession with the opening day roster.
Just a little bit.
The ultimate example being Tony Kemp made the Orioles opening day roster. He was not a factor in the 2024 Baltimore Orioles. Played in 10 games, I think, got 10 plate appearances. But at this point, I think the dream of a third catcher is probably dead because you need to have that last roster spot, have somebody who can play in the middle infield. You're looking at this roster right now of everybody who's healthy. Blaze Alexander and Gunnar Henderson are pretty much the only two guys who can play in the middle infield. So I think you have to fill that final roster spot and maybe take one or more of these guys. Luis Vasquez, Tyro Estrada, who they just signed, Peyton Eels, Jose Barrero. I mean, they pretty much have to keep another infielder who can play both short and second base.
Yeah. And that's, this is not a sliding doors conversation that I've think we've had, but when you mentioned there's no Connor Norby, there's no Joey Ortiz, those guys were obviously traded for very good pitchers. It turned out didn't feel that way in the moment with the Trevor Rogers trade, but certainly feels that way now. As you were mentioning their names, I was thinking about what a comically large amount of AAA plate appearances they could each still have if they had not been traded. We're talking like 3,000 AAA plate appearances for these guys as they're waiting, but like, reasonably, I don't think Connor Norby's going to win a Gold Glove the way that Ramon Urias did, but the Orioles could have made the decision in the moments that they were in. They could not have traded Ramon Urias for Trevor Rogers. That's not how that works. They could not have traded Joey Ortiz for Jorge Mateo for Corbin Burns. That's not how that works. But they really had the natural replacements for those guys here. Granted, years ago, traded for very reasonable and good reasons and traded for very good pitchers. But imagine a world where they didn't do that. No, and we're also imagining a world at this point where, if we're talking about sliding doors, we're probably imagining a world where like D'Angelo's family still owns his team and like David Rubenstein and Michael Arrighetti and that crew are not part of the equation, because not trading those guys is something that a team that doesn't plan to spend any money would do. But that would be an interesting fallback if they had it. They don't, and there's just a gap right now. There's been a lot of trades over the last couple of years, and not all of them have been impacted the infield depth, but this is an area where they've just kind of not been able to make that happen.
Yeah, and I think that's an area that they'd like to backfill with international free agents. Mike Elias has specifically mentioned the infield being a spot where international free agents have the ability to sign very young for a very small dollar amount, come up through the Orioles system, come up through their team system, and get to the big leagues and provide that kind of depth. And because the Orioles were so set back by a lack of international program for so many years, hopefully they can get that going. Yeah. And hopefully they can start to backfill that kind of area. All right, let's talk about Trevor Rogers, John, because when we spoke to Trevor Rogers at the start of camp, he said that a contract extension was not something that the Orioles had discussed with him. He is entering the final year of team control, coming off a season in which he had a 1.81 ERA and 109 2/3 innings pitched, 1 MVO. The story has been told a million times. He came into camp not right, built up his lower half over the first month of the season, and in the offseason started throwing the ball harder and returned to the all-star level pitcher that he had been early in his career with Miami. His expected stats, of course, were not as good as that sparkling 1.81 ERA, but that's to be expected when you have a ridiculously low ERA. Fielding independent pitching, FIP was 2.82. Expected ERA, according to StatCast, was 3.41. Expected batting average against was 2.25. Thing is, those are all still really good stats. His back of the baseball card numbers were better than his expected stats, but his expected stats would still make him close to an all-star level pitcher. He was that good. He's entering his age 28 season. The Orioles, when you look at their rotation in 2027, has Kyle Bradish, Shane Baz, Dean Kramer, and then a whole lot of question marks. Why wouldn't the Orioles engage Trevor Rogers on a contract extension?
I don't know the answers to that. I would just put off to the side that there's a world where, like, as his agent and someone in the Orioles in front office are exchanging figures for arbitration. These conversations happen and get nowhere, and it's not even worth bringing to Trevor Rogers. I think that's probably, I don't want to say that's what happened. That's a possibility. So there's a world where these conversations don't even get to Trevor Rogers, or not even to the point where the Orioles overtures would get to him. I thought that this process would be a time when it happens, because on the one hand, Trevor Rogers is so close to free agency that he is 1 year away from making
bank,
an incredible amount of money. He is also, because of how every year, how the last few years before 2025 went for him, he is also criminally underpaid based on how baseball players are paid. He's making $6.2 million this year. So we're talking about someone who you would say, if the first three, the middle 3 years between his like rookie year and last year for Trevor Rogers happen in the same way that 2025 happened, he'd be making a lot more. And once you have that thought, maybe you want a lot more money than what you're going to get in arbitration. Maybe the Orioles can take advantage of that and say, you know what, you are underpaid. Now he's got an agent who knows that, like, that's still not a good thing for him to accept a deal to make up for what he should be paid and sacrifice free agency dollars. But it felt like an opportunity. And this is an opportunity around arbitration to do this for all these players. And I don't think this is we talk about straw man arguments, like a starting pitcher of the Framber Valdez tier was seen as like the last piece to make this very, very meaningful, impactful Orioles offseason complete. I think that signing one of these guys long term this spring, while there's a chance to do it, while there's a world where you don't have whatever uncertainty of the season's performance and health and stuff, and you just got to have these guys at their best in a controlled environment, experiencing what they're experiencing down there in Craig Albenaz's camp. If there's one thing that could kind of be the hot fudge on this offseason Sunday, it's signing someone to an extension. And I think Trevor Rogers would be a really interesting person to do it with, because yes, there's been some injuries. He's 133 innings is the most he's ever pitched. So you're not talking about someone who, if you give him a 5-year contract, you're going to get 900 innings out of it. That's not, then, that would be a case to do that.
Yeah.
If, Dean Kramer is going to pitch like 900 innings over a 5-year deal, if somebody gives it to him, I don't think anybody would, but you can do that knowing that you're probably going to get that kind of downside protection. Trevor Rogers, I'm not sure, but I also think that there's a lot of teams out there that would pay for the 110 really good Trevor Rogers innings you might get every year.
Yeah. I mean, if Trevor Rogers were to hit free agency in a year's time, which he is on track to do, he's going to be entering his age 29 season. For reference, Dylan Cease just got $210 million entering his age 30 season from the Toronto Blue Jays. Framber Valdez just got 3 years, $115 million from the Detroit Tigers entering his age 32 season. If Trevor Rogers comes anywhere close to the production that he had this past year, if he reverts even to a 3.50 ERA, basically twice what he had this past year, he is still going to make a lot of money as a left-handed starter who is not yet 30, who has all of the signs of somebody who could be near the top of your rotation. So if the Orioles play this out and Trevor Rogers has an amazing season, I'm sure they'd be happy. But that means Trevor Rogers is going to be entering free agency looking like one of the best starting pitchers on the market. And I know the elephant in the room, which is Tommy John. Every starting pitcher pretty much of this era has a 90-some% chance of getting Tommy John, just picking that number out of the air.
Yeah.
It's such a high percentage, and especially it is a high percentage among guys who throw the ball pretty hard like Trevor Rogers does. Trevor Rogers hasn't had Tommy John yet. That isn't to say that he will necessarily need Tommy John at some point, and pitchers that have had Tommy John sometimes need it twice. John Means as an example there. Tommy John takes off 12 to 18 months from a guy. And if you're paying him $35 million a year, or whatever it would take to pay Trevor Rogers, and all of a sudden he goes down and needs a repair of his UCL, and he's out 12 to 18 months, that's a lot for a team that has to be cautious about how it spends its money. That's a lot for them to swallow. And that's why the Orioles, time and time again, are much more comfortable investing high draft picks in hitters as opposed to pitchers, investing big money in hitters as opposed to pitchers. So that's, and I say big money, they've really only done it with one player so far.
Yeah.
That's Pete Alonso. But essentially the Orioles are always worried about that, and it's understandable. But at the same time, you have to pay somebody. At some point, you have to pay a starting pitcher. And looking at this rotation for next year with Bradish and Boz and Kramer, because you didn't sign somebody to a long-term extension, you got multiple years of team control from Shane Boz, sure, but you signed Chris Bassett to a one-year contract. You have maybe some intriguing prospects like Trey Gibson and Nestor Herman waiting in the wings. But if you had Trevor Rogers in that rotation going into next year, you would feel so much better about that group.
Yeah, and we should add, there's a world where Zach Eflin is worth a $25 million player option. That would be a good world for the Orioles to live in. As we're talking about this, I'm thinking about, and we're basically filling the bingo card right now because we've talked about Tony Kemp, Jorge Mateo. We're basically going to be a Craig Kimbrell short of the full batch. As I mentioned, another pitcher who hit free agency in his late 20s, and you thought that would be an advantage, in Jack Flaherty, who had not a similar career, but like he didn't really have, I would say pretty fairly, that like he didn't have the resurgence, a level of resurgence that Trevor Rogers had, but he had a similar career where he debuted early and was pretty good, and then had some years when he was less than good, and then he ends up having the bounce back here with St. Louis, and then he gets traded here. And you can hit the archives to hear anyone's thoughts on how that went, but it's not a given. It took him going back into the market on a one-year deal, and even after that, the long-term deal that you kind of thought would happen never materialized. There's just, I don't know what makes teams want to pay pitchers. All it takes is one, I guess. Maybe the Orioles offered to Dylan Cease was $205 million. Maybe Toronto outbid everyone by a lot. Who knows what makes teams want to pay starting pitchers and not pay starting pitchers. And it's never going to be an occasion for a player to take less than he thinks he's worth because of that. But it feels like with all these, with Trevor Rogers, with Kyle Bradish, with any of these pitchers who we're talking about in terms of securing their futures, it feels like there's enough middle ground between what a guy makes in arbitration, what a team is willing to take on risk-wise, and what makes sense for the player themselves. Like, not everyone's going to get these massive deals. Some guys do end up, maybe we're going to see more of what the Orioles offered to Corbin Burns and what Framber Valdez signed for, where it's like, cool, we'll just give you $40 million a year for 3 years, and if you blow out for one of them, we're not dealing with 3 years of mess at the end.
Yeah.
I'm sure teams would prefer that. Maybe pitchers would prefer that. Maybe that's where this is going. But in the interim, it feels like there's a lot of room to me in the middle.
And you brought up Zach Eflin. A year ago, we were saying maybe the Orioles should consider extending Zach Eflin after 9 great starts, after he comes over from the Tampa Bay Rays and looks awesome and starts a playoff game. And then he has an injury-plagued season and has to settle for a 1-year, $10 million contract. So, the Orioles try to operate with as much information as possible. And 2025 gave them a lot more information on Zach Eflin, decreased his market, and they were able to get him for a bargain this year. What they think will be a bargain this year. So, we'll see how 2026 goes. But maybe you hope it doesn't happen. You hope he doesn't revert. You hope he stays healthy. But there's a chance that Trevor Rogers does not continue on this trajectory, and the Orioles look to bring him back next offseason for a much cheaper dollar amount than they were expecting. But they try to operate with as much information as possible. In terms of extension candidates, they already locked up Samuel Basallo. Other than Trevor Rogers, I'm not seeing too many guys that make sense for the Orioles to try to extend right now, other than Adley Rutschman. I think Adley Rutschman, if you still believe in the player, if you still believe that he can be a centerpiece in your lineup, you still believe he can be a long-term catcher behind the plate, I still think it makes sense to try to extend him, even though he is a little bit older, even though he is coming off an injury-plagued and down 2025 season, because I think that he can coexist with Samuel Basallo. Samuel Basallo, if he hits his ceiling, is going to be a terrific hitter, could be a good catcher, could be at least an average level catcher. Adley Rutschman has done a lot for this team over the last several years. I think it could make sense to try to extend him. But at the same time, if you're Adley Rutschman, you're probably not looking to sign some kind of extension right now when you're coming off what was your worst MLB season.
Yeah, there's a couple down years on the baseball card that would make Adley Rutschman want to play better and earn more. The Orioles probably would see those same things. The thing that would motivate possibly the Orioles is that Adley Rutschman as a catcher and as a presence is probably going to be worth whatever you're paying him, as long as his defensive skills don't deteriorate. And I'm thinking back, I was writing last night about the early Steve Cohen days with the Mets versus the early David Rubenstein days with the Orioles, and Pete Alonso obviously was a part of both, but James McCann was part of that early spending spree with the Mets and got 4 years, $40 million. And the Mets basically paid the Orioles to take the last 2 years of those. And the Orioles were happy to do that.
Yeah.
Because they needed that. There was a world where there were some good offensive years, and I'm not comparing James McCann as a player to Adley Rutschman. There were some good offensive years in there. There was never the potential to do what Adley Rutschman did offensively or can do offensively for James McCann. But if the Orioles could go into those conversations if Adley Rutschman wanted to play ball, knowing that if there was a reason why they would need to move on from him, and then there would be a way to do that if you want to.
Yeah. And I say nobody makes sense to sign an extension. Obviously, Gunnar Henderson would make a lot of sense to sign an extension. If you're the Orioles, you would absolutely love to lock that guy up to a long-term extension. Give him a blank check. It's not my money. I say offer him the world. The problem is you're not going to get him to sign unless you give him, half of a small country. He is still several years away from free agency. He's repped by Scott Boras, loves his agents to hit the market. It's going to take a lot, and I highly, highly doubt you're going to be able to get him to sign, but I would still be making as many calls to Scott Boras as you can reasonably to try to get an extension done. Jordan Westberg, another guy who's repped by Scott Boras. Now you have all these injury concerns with Jordan Westberg, and I hate to say it. The potential is there. The talent is there. But he keeps missing time, and that's certainly a concern. You add in the Scott Boras factor, that makes things difficult to get a deal done. So is Jackson Holliday, another guy who was repped by Scott Boras. That seems unlikely that you're going to reach a deal there. And then Colton Cowser, coming off a season which he hit below the Mendoza line, played through injuries, struggled with injuries. I have a hard time handing a lot of money in a long-term extension to somebody who's coming off that kind of season.
Yeah. I'd be interested to kind of, I think there's more Colton Cowser upside in there.
I think so too.
Than most, and I'm not going to pick him as the MVO this year. That I might just abstain from doing those picks, honestly. If we're
got to do the predictions.
Come on, man. I don't want to do that. and I might not. Let's make it perfectly clear. I'm just going to lay out on a mark right now. I might not make predictions this year.
Okay. I'll be the one that puts my butt on the line.
I was having a conversation with a mental health professional about how this year might be different because I'm not making predictions. So I'm going to put my money where my mouth is.
Hey, I predicted the Orioles to win 20 more games than they actually did last year. So I don't think anybody should listen to my predictions. I'll make that clear.
Yeah, definitely how I feel about my own. I also don't care about them. I got a head nod in the press box for the 2023 playoffs when we did the predictions, and it was like, what do you think is going to happen in this series? And I just didn't say. Or what do you think is going to happen in the playoffs? And these teams are either going to play for 3 days or 3 weeks. And I was right, but I didn't say they're going to get swept. I said they're either going to get swept or they're going to go to the World Series, and one of those two things happen.
That's true.
What were we talking about?
Both sides.
Colton Cowser.
Yeah.
In the spirit of let's just take as much uncertainty and pressure off of people and let them just feel comfortable doing their thing.
Mm-hmm.
That is a candidate of if he's just here for 7 years and $70 million, that's a made up number. It's probably, I don't know. That actually might feel
could work. Yeah.
I don't know why he would do that.
Maybe 70. Yeah, that would be.
But if you're basically not making any money for the first two more of those years. Maybe you think about it. No, I just made that number up. But if knowing that helps Colton Cowser play better, sure.
But that's a risk.
That's also not really how this works. And exactly. I understand that as I'm saying it.
All right. Well, we have plenty more spring training baseball to be played, plenty more fake baseball to watch over the coming weeks before we get to real baseball at some point. We will have you covered on thebanner.com, where you can subscribe $1 for 6 months. Get John's newsletter, Inside the Dugout.
Interesting outing in the latter half of the game. We know we don't care about spring training.
You said you don't care. Yeah. But
Giancarlo Enriquez, 97s.
Hey, somebody wrote a story about him. I
like
believe.
That story. I just want to pump it up. It was really fun to write. Paul,
how do you say rubber arm in Spanish?
Brazo de goma.
There it is. He's got that rubber arm.
Yeah.
He is one of the non-roster invitees for this team, right?
Yeah.
He is large, in charge,
huge dude,
and
great story. It's going to be a movie if he makes a team.
He is fun to watch from the backfields if he is controlling the ball.
I need to make this very clear, Paul. If my story gets optioned to be a movie, I will still do this podcast, even though I'll be rich and famous.
Wow. Thank you. Hey, we got Justin Fenton to still work for the Baltimore Banner, despite the fact that his book got turned into an HBO miniseries. So you never know.
Yeah.
When this Orioles team becomes the subject of Moneyball 2 or something like that.
Yeah, like spending Moneyball.
Spending Moneyball. Yeah. Then we'll still keep it covered. Follow Andy Kuska, who's down in Sarasota. He's got all of your daily Grapefruit League action and Orioles storylines on lock. For John Meoli, I'm Paul Mancano. We'll have another episode for you at some point next week. In the meantime,